This month, I finally got around to playing the Resident Evil 4 remake, and the moment I finished it 2 or 3 days ago, the first thing I wanted to do was get on here and talk about it because, as you know, if you're a regular of this channel, I want to talk about the games I love and the reason I have an emotional connection to them. And I've been a modern Resident Evil fan for quite a while. Obviously, I'm a little bit too young to play the original games, so obviously definitely not when they came out. But obviously, it's a series which is, steeped in history, has a really big cult following, and the games as a whole quite hit or miss. But Capcom, since they've sort of turned a new leaf with Resident Evil 7, which is one of the first ones I played, really nailed that formula down. And that was when they went back to their roots with a proper, authentic survival horror experience. And then sort of knocked it out the park with Resident Evil 2 Remake, which is one of my favorite games and one I'll probably talk about on this channel as well at some point. And those were the two games that really got me into the franchise. So from then on, I was pretty hooked. And I played 3 when it came out, and it was a bit disappointing, to be honest with you. It lacked that sort of horror element that these newer rebooted versions of the game series had come out with. And it generally wasn't a cohesive experience, nor was it worth the full AAA price they were charging. So with that in mind, when we got the announcement for Resident Evil 4 Remake, which is largely the most beloved game in the franchise, there was a lot of apprehension towards it with how it was going to come out, because obviously 3 Remake, which very much followed a similar formula, people were worried it wasn't going to live up to the expectations some people were putting up for it, but also how good the original was. Were they able to surpass it? And when it dropped in 2023 around springtime last year, I think people were proven wrong, happily so, because it was critically acclaimed, one of the best gaming experiences of not just 2023, but really in the last 5-10 years. And obviously it'd been on my radar for a long time, but I had a backlog of games I really wanted to get through first. So I held off on it until just recently, and I managed to pick it up for a pretty cheap price. And I'm glad to say I absolutely loved it, because one of the biggest problems I had, as I just mentioned, was my favorite part of the Resident Evil franchise is where they really go full survival horror. They really lean away from the actiony, more shooting elements of the game series and lean into that atmospheric horror, which they're so good at when they really commit themselves to it. I think back to Resident Evil 8, or Resident Evil Village as it's known. I was very excited when that game came out because I knew and I'd heard through fans of the series that it was meant to be a spiritual successor to 4. So I'd heard all these good things. I was like, right, this must be a great experience. And it kind of just missed the mark for me. There were some really high highs with the horror elements it had. If you've played the game, House Benevito is one of the scariest parts of the series, let alone the game. But it tends to fall apart near the later parts of the game, narrative-wise and from a gameplay perspective as well. So it didn't really, land for me. So I had a little bit of a sour taste in my mouth, as did a lot of people going into Resident Evil 4 Remake. But, speaking from my own experience now, after hearing all the good things, I can absolutely agree with the general sentiment. It is a phenomenal experience for so many reasons. And, one thing I always like to focus on when I talk about these games and why I love them is gameplay, and being able to perfect the gameplay loop so well. And that's such a difficult thing to do. I think a lot of people don't realize that is within game design, being able to have a core gameplay loop that is so stimulating and rewarding that it makes the player want to come back regardless of everything else. If you have a good gameplay loop down, it gets people coming back. Destiny, I spoke about that a couple of weeks ago, is a perfect example. And Resident Evil 4 Remake in particular nails it to a T. It has that weighty shooting feel where you don't feel overpowered at all, really, during the game. Everything, every kill, every shot, every bullet, and every bit of ammo you get feels earned. And it almost feels like you're just hanging on by a thread, which they nail that fine line perfectly to make you almost feel like you're in trouble without, it feeling obtuse. Do you know what I'm saying? So it was a very, tight experience in that regard. Now, the original Resident Evil 4 and, of course, the remake were the first in the series to really lean into the actiony element that I spoke about that I didn't really enjoy too much. But I think the way they approached it with the remake, they balanced it perfectly well. They had the elements of survival horror, but they kept the actiony elements and the cheesiness, which is, a very hot or cold element to the series, which I think they missed the mark hugely on with 8. I think it's one of the biggest problems with the game is the poor writing, particularly from the protagonist, who is generally just insufferable. But playing as Leon S. Kennedy, as you do in 2, and 4, they up the ante. They make him this cool, badass guy. And, you know, he is an action hero. That's kind of what they're going for. But because they lean into the cheesiness and they know what they're doing, I almost decided to embrace it, which I never think I really did with 8. And that's probably why I didn't enjoy it as much. But I decided to say, screw it, let's lean into this and just enjoy it for what it is. And I ended up coming out of the experience much more fulfilled. You know, they have these crazy grand set pieces. Without going too much into spoilers, though, it is an old game. You know, and Leon's constantly pumping out these silly one-liners for no reason. And it's generally just a polarizing experience, but probably in a more positive way. And, you know, when you talk about remakes in general, there tends to be a general apprehension, which is what I spoke about. But, you know, looking universally at games, it almost feels like the trope at this point of remakes and remasters is so overdone that there almost seems to be a bit of fatigue in that regard. And there are a few exceptions. I look at the Dead Space remake, which I also played, another really tight and well-made survival horror experience. That was a good example, but there's a lot of, you know, games out there that don't need these sort of remakes and remasters. I know Horizon Zero Dawn is getting one coming soon, and that really baffles me. I'm scratching my head wondering why. I always felt like for a game to have a remake or a remaster, it needs to be earned and deserved. And I think Resident Evil 4 is, you know, there's no better example of a game that deserves one than that. And, you know, when it comes to these sort of things, it's important that the developers remain faithful to the original source material whilst, you know, enhancing and elevating what was already there for a modern audience and a modern game. And I think the perfect example of that is the opening sequence. If you played the demo, that came out before the game fully released last year. I actually played that at the time, and it's the opening sequence from the game mixed in with the first scene in the village, which, you know, if you played the game, you know how iconic that really is. And it sets the tone perfectly. It is one of the best examples of building atmosphere and tension and showing and not telling that I've seen in modern gaming and gaming, my entire gaming life, really. It is a nailed experience. You know, you go from this very slow, tense and eerie just forest element. Resident Evil 8 does this perfectly well too, I feel I have to mention. And then they gradually build you into, you know, when you enter the village for the first time, and they throw you into this big action set piece, and it's not on rails. You have to figure everything out on your own. The controls given to you at that point are very limited, and it throws you into this absolute frenzy. And it's a magical experience, I have to say. And since playing through the Resident Evil 4 remake, it really reignited my passion, not just for games, which I've almost, you know, fell in and out of love with over the last year for various different reasons, work commitments, etc., etc. It really reignited that passion, but it also made me want to replay all the old Resident Evil games that I'd already played through, and then some, going back and play the ones I haven't. And 8 is the one I really want to go back and touch on. And the main reason was that I went and rewatched Skill Up, who, shout out to him, he's an incredible reviewer on YouTube, my favorite game reviewer out there. When he reviewed Resident Evil 8 at the time, he didn't like it. And in his Resident Evil 4 review, the remake, he went back and played 8 and said how much his opinion had changed on it over time based on playing 4, and he could see what the developers were going on to trying to achieve and sort of bring to the player. And of course, as I said, 8 is regarded as a spiritual successor to 4. So obviously there's a lot of connection there in terms of remote village, very gothic elements, and a grand sense of scale and bigger set pieces as you go later through the game. A lot of parallels there. And so that's something I really want to do. And just recently I went back and played a little bit through 7 and 2, and it just, you know, I already like those games, as I mentioned, but I think after playing through 4, it almost was just not just a reminder, but even enhance the experiences I already had, because the Resident Evil formula is very recognizable. There's not really a game series that does it like they do, for better or worse, because there's a lot of negatives to the franchise, as I said, when they lent more into the action side of things. I haven't actually played number 6, but that is the most egregious example, and was the reason they rebooted the series so drastically when they relaunched 7 and went full, you know, movie horror with the game, you know, to critical acclaim, might I add. And one of the big inspirations, not just for this video, but this channel as a whole, was, of course, if you watched my first video on Dark Souls 3, I touched on Nakey Jakey's second channel review style format, which is pretty much akin to this. I'm essentially ripping him off, so shout out to him. But the 2 videos he did in this style, the first of them was the Resident Evil 4 remake, talking about that and all the elements he loved, and after playing and watching through the original. You know, him exploring his love for the game and just discussing what made it so special, and how he felt like when he was playing through the game, he experienced a specific moment where he acknowledged the greatness he was experienced before he'd even beaten the game. And I think that's the mark of a, not just a special game, but just a special piece of media as a whole. There's very few things that can really evoke that emotion within you. I wouldn't say Resident Evil 4 hit me the exact same way as it might have done for him and some other people. That doesn't mean I loved it any less. I thought it was a very tight experience and brought back the love I had for the franchise, which I felt was wilting just a little bit. And with how tonally grating the Resident Evil formula, as I like to say, you know, is just present throughout the game. It's very back and forth of what kind of game it wants to be, but just localized within that series, it works so well. And that's partly due to the core game design philosophy that the development team really fostered, you know, over the years working on these games. I'm not going to sit here as a result and say that it's a game and a series that's for everybody. But I always say, you know, with these games and with these, I talk about in each of these videos, be willing to broaden your horizons and try new things, because, you know, I think that is what stops a lot of people, not just in games, but in life. We're getting really philosophical here. But it stops them from really having some of the greatest experiences they can have. And within the realms of games, you know, I speak to an example. I spoke about Dark Souls, and I speak about it in almost every video, but it was never a game or a franchise that I ever wanted to touch just by looking at it. It's very unappealing in its design and its look. And to some people, that might be the same with Resident Evil. But if you're willing to just give it 5 minutes, you'll just, you know, there's a good chance you might just be hooked on it. And you know, yeah, go give it a crack if you haven't. Damn good game, and in a lot of ways, a damn good series too.